Hey there, viewers. Before we get into this intense courtroom moment, let me ask, if you could sit in on any trial in history, which one would it be? Drop your answer in the comments. Today's story takes you inside Diddy's trial, where a teen victim's testimony left the entire room in stunned silence. Let's dive in. Chapter 1. The Weight of the Courtroom. I had never been inside a courtroom before, not for a real case at least. I had seen them in movies, on TV, in news clips where serious-looking men in suits sat around a judge's bench flipping through paperwork while people's lives hung in the balance. But standing there now, just inside the heavy wooden doors, I realized nothing could have prepared me for the way the air actually felt inside one. It was heavy, thick in a way I couldn't quite explain, like stepping into a place where the walls remembered everything that had ever happened inside them, the kind of space where whispered truths and desperate pleas had sunk into the wood over years, decades, until they became part of the room itself. I adjusted my jacket, suddenly feeling too warm despite the courthouse's air conditioning. The crowd inside was packed so tightly that the room felt smaller than it actually was. Every seat was filled, every spare inch of standing room taken by spectators, reporters, legal analysts, people who just needed to be here, needed to see this with their own eyes. Some were whispering, voices hushed but urgent, trading theories about how today would go. Others were scribbling notes, tapping on laptops, adjusting their cameras before they were forced to put them away. It was a rare sight to see so many different people in one place, all waiting for the same moment. Because today wasn't just another day in court. Today, the girl was going to testify. I took a slow breath and stepped further in, searching for a place to stand where I wouldn't be in the way. The closer I got to the front, the quieter the murmurs became, until all that was left was the rhythmic shuffle of papers, the occasional scrape of a chair against the polished floor, the low hum of tension pressing down on all of us. And then, at the front of the room, I saw him. Diddy sat at the defense table, completely still, his hands folded neatly in front of him, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the judge's bench. From a distance, he looked exactly the way he had always looked in interviews at award shows and magazine spreads. Polished, composed, unbothered. His dark suit was crisp, the material expensive enough that even under the courtroom's dim lighting it seemed to catch and absorb the glow. His tie was perfect, not a crease out of place. He looked like a man who had never known fear, never known desperation. But up close, I could see the cracks. The bags under his eyes were deeper than I had ever seen them, as if sleep had stopped coming to him altogether. His posture, while still controlled, had a rigidity to it that didn't seem natural, not the casual confidence of a man who knew he was untouchable, more like someone forcing themselves to sit still. His legal team was a different story. They were sharp in every sense of the word. Their suits, their expressions, their whispered conversations, it was all calculated, controlled, methodical. They spoke to each other in low voices, strategizing, never letting anything about their expressions slip. Even as reporters tried to read their body language, even as eyes lingered on them, waiting for a reaction, they stayed unreadable. Occasionally, Diddy's gaze would shift, scanning the room as if measuring the temperature of the space. He didn't linger on anyone, didn't let his attention rest in one place for too long. But there was something behind his eyes that made my stomach twist. A weight. A knowing. He had seen rooms like this before, but not like this. Because today there was no stage, no cameras he could control, no one to edit the footage before it was released to the world. Today he had to sit there and listen. I swallowed hard, my fingers tightening into fists at my sides. I wasn't supposed to be here. I had no credentials, no personal connection to this case. I was just someone who had followed the stories, read the accusations, watched the headlines roll out year after year. I had seen how the powerful always seemed to slip through the cracks, how stories got buried, how people got silenced. But this time felt different, and I had to see it for myself. I barely had time to process that thought before the sound of shuffling papers brought my attention back to the judge's bench. The room settled, the energy shifting from anticipation to something sharper. And then, the moment we were all waiting for, a name was called. The girl's name. And just like that, the room changed. It wasn't just that people fell silent. It was deeper than that. It was the kind of silence that felt alive, crawling under your skin, making your pulse race, even though no one had moved. Even the judge, who had been neutral up until this point, shifted slightly in their chair, their hands steepled in front of them. The attorneys sat straighter, eyes trained on the entrance at the back of the courtroom. The double doors opened. A court officer stepped inside first, scanning the room, as if checking to make sure everything was safe. And then she walked in. She was small, too small for a courtroom like this. The oversized blazer she wore made her look even smaller, like she had borrowed it from someone older, someone who knew how to navigate places like this. Her hands were clenched at her sides, her fingers tightening and loosening in quick, nervous bursts. She didn't look at the crowd, didn't glance at the reporters or the jury or the man sitting at the defense table. She only looked straight ahead. And for a moment I thought she might turn around and run. But then she kept walking, one foot in front of the other, every step deliberate, forced, like her body was fighting her, like every survival instinct was screaming at her to get out. But she didn't. She walked to the stand, and when she reached it, she took a slow breath and adjusted her blazer. I could see the way her shoulders rose and fell, the way her jaw clenched for half a second before she turned to the judge. She was afraid, but she was ready. The judge spoke to her in a voice that was calm, patient. She answered in a voice that was thin, small, but she didn't look away. She took the oath, her hand trembling slightly as she raised it. I thought about how many other girls had probably sat in places like this, how many of them had been asked to relive the worst moments of their lives in rooms full of strangers, full of people waiting to rip their stories apart. But she was here anyway. The attorneys shifted. The jury leaned forward. The room felt smaller, tighter, heavier. And as I looked back toward the defense table, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. Diddy had finally stopped looking around. His eyes were locked on her now, watching, waiting. And the second the first question left the prosecutor's lips, I knew we weren't just watching a trial anymore. We were watching the moment everything was about to change. Chapter 2. A girl against power. The courtroom had already felt heavy before, but now, as she sat there, hands gripping the wooden railing of the witness stand, the weight in the air became unbearable. It was like the oxygen had been sucked from the room, leaving only the sound of her unsteady breathing and the faint rustling of paper as the prosecutor adjusted their notes. She didn't speak right away. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out at first, and for a second I thought she might not be able to do it. She blinked, swallowed hard, her lips parting again, but then she hesitated, like her own body was fighting against her. The tremor in her fingers was barely noticeable unless you were looking for it, but I was. Her hands tightened against the railing, her knuckles turning white, her breath coming in shallow bursts. No one in the room moved. No one coughed. No one shifted in their seat. Even the judge remained still, watching with the kind of patience that told me they had seen this before. Had seen the way trauma lodged itself inside a person's throat, clawing at them from the inside, making them choke on their own truth. The prosecutor, a woman with sharp eyes and a steady presence, leaned forward slightly. "Take your time," she said, her voice calm but firm, the kind of tone designed to anchor someone back to reality. The girl exhaled slowly, her shoulders rising and falling. She nodded once, barely perceptible, then lifted her eyes toward the judge, as if confirming to herself that she was really here, that this was really happening. Then, finally, her voice came. I was 16. It was almost a whisper, but somehow it felt like it shook the walls. There was something final in the way she said it. A small sentence, just 3 words, yet it sent a ripple through the room. I felt it. The jury felt it. Even the reporters, who had likely heard countless testimonies in their careers, felt it. But the defense didn't move. Not yet. Diddy's attorneys sat in eerie stillness, their pens still against their notepads, their gazes unreadable. If they exchanged glances, it was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I knew what was happening. This was a strategy. Let her speak, let her falter, then strike when she's at her most vulnerable. The prosecutor nodded encouragingly. Can you tell us what happened? The girl exhaled again, slower this time, but she didn't look at the defense table. She didn't look at Diddy. I don't think she could. Her gaze dropped to her lap for half a second, and then she lifted it again, staring at a fixed point just above the jury's heads, as if addressing something beyond the people in front of her. I was invited to a party, she said. Her voice was stronger now, steadier, though the hesitance was still there, still lurking beneath the surface. It wasn't supposed to be anything bad. It was supposed to be a networking thing. My friend told me it was a good opportunity, that important people would be there, that I could meet people who could help me. A murmur ran through the spectators, but it was brief, cut off almost immediately as the judge glanced up, reminding everyone that this was not a place for interruptions. The girl's fingers curled slightly against the stand, the movement so small it was almost invisible. I didn't know any better, she continued. I was just a kid. She hesitated again, as if the next words were harder to push out. But when I got there, it wasn't what I thought it would be. The prosecutor's voice remained patient. What do you mean? The girl licked her lips, pressing them together for a moment before answering. The place was big, too big. It didn't feel real. It was like walking into something from a music video. The kind of party you see in magazines. Expensive furniture, glass tables, white couches, floors so clean I could see my own reflection when I walked in. Her voice grew quieter. And there were so many girls, I thought. At first I thought maybe they were like me, just there for the opportunity, but they weren't. She looked down for a second, her expression tightening. Some of them were my age, some of them were younger. Someone in the audience let out an audible breath, not a gasp, not quite, but close enough. It didn't matter though. The tension had already seeped into every corner of the room, wrapping itself around us like a living thing. The prosecutor didn't rush her. What happened when you got inside? The girl's hands clenched the railing again, just slightly. There were people everywhere, men mostly, older. They sat on the couches, talking, drinking, laughing. Some of them had girls on their laps, some of them just watched. She paused, blinking hard, like she was trying to clear the images from her mind. And then someone gave me a drink. At this, one of Diddy's attorneys finally moved. Not much, just a shift of posture, a glance toward their notes, but it was enough to make my stomach tighten. The girl didn't seem to notice. I didn't think anything of it, she said. It was just a drink. My friend told me to take it, that it was fine, that I needed to loosen up. She swallowed. I don't even remember finishing it. The prosecutor nodded, giving her space to continue. Her eyes flickered toward the jury now, just briefly. Everything after that felt strange. Like I was watching it happen to someone else. Like I was underwater, moving through something heavy. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I remember walking through the crowd, she said, her voice softer now, like she was no longer just speaking for the court, but speaking to herself, trying to piece it together in real time. I remember hearing music, the bass so deep I felt it in my chest, and then, she swallowed hard, then I wasn't in the party anymore. At this, the defense lawyer lifted a pen. Another note, another subtle shift. The girl continued, her voice almost detached now, like she was forcing herself to keep going before she lost the ability to. I was in a different room. It was dark. I didn't remember walking there. Her hands tightened. I didn't know how I got there. The silence that followed was unbearable. The jury was locked on her now. No shifting, no glancing around, just focused, silent, waiting. And when I realized I wasn't alone, she whispered. That's when I got scared. I don't know if I was holding my breath before, but at that moment it felt like I couldn't inhale. The prosecutor leaned in. Who was there with you? The girl's lips parted slightly, but for the first time she hesitated. Not like before, not out of fear of speaking. This was different. It was like stepping up to the edge of a cliff and knowing that the moment you say the next words, you're jumping. I saw it in her body, in the way she tensed, in the way her eyes flickered just for a split second toward the man at the defense table. And then, just as before, she didn't look away. I felt my stomach drop. The prosecutor's voice remained steady. Who? The girl inhaled sharply, her jaw tightening, and when she finally spoke, her voice didn't waver. Sean Combs. The words didn't just land, they detonated. I barely heard the scattered gasps, barely noticed the way people tensed, the way some reporters nearly dropped their pens. All I could focus on was the moment itself, the moment everything changed. And across the room, for the first time since the trial started, Diddy moved. His fingers curled slightly against the table just for a second, a minuscule movement so small it was almost unnoticeable, but it was there. And I knew, in that moment, that he felt it too. Chapter 3. The Party That Wasn't a Party. The way she spoke about that night made it feel like a memory that didn't belong to her, like she was borrowing someone else's trauma just to survive the telling of it. There was no hesitation now, no choked-back sobs, no flickers of doubt, just the cold, steady recounting of a girl who had walked into a place she didn't understand and left as someone she never wanted to be. She said she had been excited at first. She hadn't seen it as an invitation into something dangerous. It was an opportunity, a golden ticket into a world most people could only dream of. A friend, someone she had trusted, someone she thought knew the right people, had told her about it, saying it was a networking event, a place where young talent, fresh faces, and industry insiders could rub shoulders and make connections. It had sounded professional, harmless, and when she had arrived, it had even looked the part. The penthouse had been in Manhattan, sitting high above the streets, wrapped in floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased the glittering city below. She described the way the lights had blurred together, how the view from that high up made it feel like the real world had already disappeared behind her the moment she stepped inside. The music had been loud, too loud, vibrating through the floor, slipping beneath her skin, making her bones hum. Every surface had gleamed, glass tables, polished marble, sleek white furniture that didn't look like it had ever actually been used. And yet, something had been off. Even before she knew what was really happening, she had felt it, a wrongness that sat just beneath the surface, hidden under layers of luxury and excess. There were too many girls. At first, it had seemed normal. They were dressed up, made up, standing in little groups, talking and laughing in ways that didn't quite reach their eyes. Some were draped over the arms of older men in tailored suits, their smiles fixed in place like props in someone else's fantasy. She had assumed at first that they were models, influencers, aspiring actresses, that they, like her, had come here for an opportunity. But then, she had started to notice the details. The way some of them moved too quickly when a hand brushed against their waist, The way a girl standing near the bar kept looking toward the door like she was waiting for someone to come back for her. The way another girl on a couch had gone completely still when a man whispered something in her ear, her fingers tightening around the stem of her champagne glass. They weren't guests. They were part of something, a puzzle she hadn't figured out yet. And then someone handed her a drink. She couldn't even remember who it had been. She had been standing near the bar, watching, trying to figure out the social rules of this place when a glass appeared in her hand. It was already open, she said, her voice almost detached now, like she was reciting a script she had memorized too well. I remember thinking that was weird. The bartender didn't hand it to me. No one asked me what I wanted. Someone just placed it in my hand. The prosecutor's expression remained unreadable. "Do you remember what was in it?" She swallowed. It tasted sweet, but not in a good way, like something covering up something else. Another pause. "Why? I didn't even drink the whole thing." Her fingers curled against the railing of the stand. "At least I don't think I did." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. She explained how things had started to blur after that. Not in a drunk way, not in a way that made sense. The music had felt too deep, sinking into her skin like it was pressing her down. The lights had seemed too sharp, cutting into her vision. Laughter had started to sound wrong, too loud, too forced, stretching and warping at the edges. And the faces had started to lose definition. She remembered turning her head and feeling like it didn't belong to her. Remembered the way her limbs had suddenly felt, too light and too heavy at the same time. Remembered smoke curling through the air, perfume mixing with the smell of alcohol and something sickly sweet. The room had swam, tilted, and yet she hadn't been scared. Not yet. She had just felt detached, like she was watching herself from outside her own body. One moment she had been standing near the bar, and then she hadn't been. She didn't remember walking away, didn't remember who had taken her hand, didn't remember moving through the penthouse, leaving behind the sound of clinking glasses and murmured conversations. But she remembered where she ended up. The room had been dark. Not pitch black, just dim, like the lights had been deliberately lowered, like someone had set the scene for something that wasn't meant to be seen too clearly. There had been a bed, a couch, a table with glasses half full of something golden, and she hadn't been alone. She could hear them before she could fully see them. Low voices, laughter, the shift of fabric, the soft click of a lighter. And then pressure. Her breath hitched. She had felt it before she understood what was happening. The weight of hands on her wrists, her ankles. The sensation of something pressing down on her chest. She had tried to move, had tried to speak, had tried to turn her head, to push herself up to get away, but she couldn't. Her limbs felt wrong, like they weren't hers anymore, like they had been disconnected from her mind. "I thought I was moving," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought. I was trying to fight, but I don't think my body was actually moving." Her throat worked as she swallowed again. And then, the smell. She hadn't noticed it at first. It had been buried beneath the alcohol, beneath the perfume, beneath the faint trace of cigars and cologne. But when she had felt something cold against her skin, the scent had become overwhelming. Baby oil. That was when she had known. A shudder passed through her body, but she didn't stop. "There were people in the room," she said. "Men, women too. Watching." My stomach twisted. Then came the part no one was prepared for. The prosecutor's voice was careful. "Did you recognize anyone in the room?" A pause. Her fingers tightened around the railing. Her jaw clenched. And then the words that burned themselves into the air, into the walls, into every single person sitting in that room. He was there. Silence. Heavy. Suffocating. The prosecutor's voice didn't waver. Who? She didn't hesitate. Sean Combs. I felt the courtroom shift beneath me. The judge sat up straighter. The jury froze. Diddy still didn't move. His face remained neutral, composed. But I saw it. The way his fingers curled slightly against the table. The smallest reaction. But it was there. And I knew. He knew this was the moment everything changed. Chapter 4. He was there. The air in the courtroom shifted the moment she spoke his name. It wasn't just the words themselves, though they carried an undeniable weight. It was the fact that she had said them in that particular setting, under oath, in front of a jury, with the knowledge that everything she said would be scrutinized and held up to the light. In this moment, there was no room for rumors, no safe distance between speculation and truth. She had spoken it aloud for the first time, and it was real. Sometimes. It wasn't a shock, not really. There had been whispers, accusations that had swirled around him for years. Everyone in that room, everyone who had followed the case, had heard the rumors, the gossip, the whispers from people too afraid to come forward themselves. But it wasn't just the fact that she had said it, it was the context. This wasn't a casual conversation over drinks. This wasn't someone speculating in a private discussion. This was her, sitting there, the victim of a crime, testifying in front of a courtroom full of people, with the eyes of the world on her. For a moment, the entire room seemed to breathe in at once. Everyone, from the reporters frantically scribbling down notes to the spectators in the back, straining to hear, tensed up, everyone inhaled. And then, as if the weight of her words had dragged the air from the room, there was nothing but silence. The kind of silence that wasn't just quiet, it was heavy. It wasn't just a pause, it was a shift. The judge's eyes moved, but it wasn't just a casual glance. It was deliberate, slow, like he was trying to gauge something more than just the truth of what she'd said. His eyes moved over to Diddy, still sitting at the defense table, his expression unreadable. The judge studied him, not just as a figure in the trial, but as a man at the center of it all. The man who, until now, had been untouchable in the eyes of the public. And yet now, in this moment, the courtroom was full of people who were willing to confront him with the truth, whether he liked it or not. There was a shift in how everyone in that room perceived the case. It wasn't just a case anymore. This was something bigger. This wasn't a legal battle or a fight over semantics or technicalities. This was a moment of reckoning. The kind of moment that didn't happen often. The kind that people would talk about for years, that would find its place in history as a turning point. The prosecutor didn't immediately press for more details. She let the words settle in the air. She knew what had just happened. She had been a part of something huge. This wasn't just about proving one crime, it was about something deeper. The ripple effect of this trial would be felt far beyond the courtroom, no matter the outcome. Even the defense team, so composed and meticulous just moments ago, felt it. Diddy's attorneys, who had remained perfectly still up to that point, exchanged quick, subtle glances. They didn't look at him, not directly, not yet. But it didn't take much to realize that the balance had shifted. There was a change in the air, a sense of something fragile, something that was slipping through their fingers. The quiet scribbling of notes started again, but it was no longer smooth. It was hurried, tense. The defense was still quiet. There were no outbursts, no immediate attempts to shut down the testimony, not yet. But I could see it, the shift in their demeanor. They were already calculating, trying to figure out how to navigate this moment, how to erase it, how to neutralize it. And then there was Diddy. He hadn't reacted, not at first. He had just remained there, his gaze unwavering, locked on something distant, his hands still, perfectly clasped in front of him. But there was something about the way his body was tensed that betrayed the calmness of his face. He didn't flinch. He didn't move. There was no change in his posture, no twitch of his jaw. But I could feel it. He was aware. The weight of those words had landed on him like a strike. It was a kind of stillness that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't calm confidence. It was the kind of stillness that comes from being cornered. I'd been in enough tense situations to know it. His body was poised, frozen in an almost unnatural way, like a predator, trying to remain still, trying not to show its hand. He was waiting for the storm to hit. When the prosecutor asked the next question, she was careful, deliberate. "Did he say anything to you?" The victim didn't hesitate. She nodded, her voice steady as she spoke the words that had been haunting her for years. "You have to prove you belong here." I could feel the collective breath of the room being held. Every word was felt, every syllable was a bead on a string of realization. The defense didn't jump in, the judge didn't react, but I could see the small shifts in people around me. The jury's bodies leaned in. There were no eyes wandering now. Everyone was watching. Every detail was now under the microscope. But it was the next part that changed everything, that added another layer of dread to the already suffocating atmosphere. They told me no one would believe me. At those words, the defense reacted. I saw the quick exchange of glances between Diddy's legal team. One of them raised their hand in a small but immediate gesture, a subtle move to cut her off before the damage could spread further. The prosecutor hesitated, waiting for the judge to give his ruling. "Objection, Your Honor. Speculation." The defense lawyer's voice was firm, practiced. The exact words I had expected to hear. It was an attempt to invalidate her experience, to undermine the very basis of her testimony. Speculate. The judge, however, didn't even flinch. He let the words linger in the air for a long moment before turning his attention to the defense team. "Let her speak," he said simply, his voice deep, authoritative. I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of relief. The judge had just allowed her to continue, giving her space to speak, and she did. She took a breath, steadying herself, her hands trembling slightly again, but this time, she didn't waver. "They told me no one would believe me," she repeated, this time her voice breaking just slightly, but it wasn't from fear. It was from the weight of the truth, a truth she had been carrying for far too long. I watched Diddy's attorneys, and they didn't speak. They didn't say anything out loud, but there was something in their posture now. They weren't making notes. They weren't exchanging glances anymore. They were waiting, like the room had just turned into an alien space, and they were the only ones who hadn't been given a map to navigate it. The jury, even though they were supposed to remain neutral, shifted. I could see it in their eyes. They weren't just listening to her anymore. They were processing. They were absorbing the weight of her words. And then, for the first time, I saw it. Diddy turned his head slightly toward the witness stand, his eyes narrowing just a fraction as if he had been snapped out of a trance. His gaze was steady, but there was something different in it now. There was a spark of recognition. He knew, in that moment, that he was no longer untouchable. For the first time, the victim had made him blink, and not physically, but mentally. The damage had already been done, and it wasn't about what came next anymore. It wasn't about how the defense could recover from this. It was about what had been said, and the fact that, for the first time, someone had had the courage to say it out loud. The courtroom had shifted. There was no turning back now. And I knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. Chapter 5, Breaking the Silence. The defense attorney stood up slowly, adjusting the cuffs of his suit with the kind of deliberate ease that made my stomach turn. He wasn't in a rush, he wasn't rattled. If anything, he looked pleased, like this was the moment he had been waiting for. He exhaled through his nose, then started toward the witness stand with a measured, practiced pace. Not too slow, not too fast. Everything about him, from the way he carried himself to the way his fingers barely grazed the edge of the wooden podium, screamed control. This was his game. He stopped just short of where she sat, tilting his head slightly, studying her like she was some sort of puzzle he was about to solve in front of everyone. It was predatory without being obvious, calculated without being outright cruel. Then finally he spoke. His voice was softer than I expected, not the aggressive, confrontational tone I had prepared myself for. Instead, it was smooth, almost sympathetic, like he was about to ask her how her day had been instead of systematically picking her apart. "You were 16 when this happened," he said, repeating the fact as if he was confirming something simple, something indisputable. She nodded once. "And this was your first time at one of these parties?" Another nod. The defense attorney sighed, shifting his weight slightly. "I can imagine that must have been overwhelming for you, a young girl in a setting like that, around so many powerful people." It wasn't a question, it was a statement. A subtle, insidious one. Because buried beneath his words was an implication that she had been naive, that she had misread the situation, that maybe it wasn't what she thought it was. The prosecutor caught it immediately. "Objection, leading." The judge barely glanced up. Sustained. The attorney didn't react. He expected the pushback. He turned back to her, that same almost calmed expression on his face. "Tell me something," he continued, his voice level. "Why didn't you go to the police that night?" And there it was. The first real strike. She stiffened, but it was barely noticeable. Just a flicker of tension in her jaw, a tightening of her fingers around the railing in front of her. The attorney watched her carefully, waiting for her reaction, giving her just enough silence to let the weight of the question settle. She swallowed, her lips pressing together for a moment before she spoke. "I was scared." The attorney nodded slightly, like he was almost satisfied with that answer. But it was an act. He wasn't going to let her off that easily. "Scared of what, exactly?" She exhaled. "Scared that no one would believe me." There was a pause. Then the defense attorney tilted his head slightly, his expression shifting into something almost pitying.
"Wait."
"That's understandable," he said. "But I want to make sure I understand this correctly. You didn't go to the police? You didn't file a report? You didn't even tell an adult that night? Is that correct?" The prosecutor was already on their feet. "Objection," badgering the witness. Sustained. But the damage was done. The attorney had gotten what he wanted. He had planted the seed. Because now the jury was thinking about it. Why didn't she go to the police? Even though it should have been obvious. Fear, power, trauma, even though every person in that room should have understood why a 16-year-old girl wouldn't immediately file a report against one of the most powerful men in the world, the doubt was creeping in. And the attorney knew it. He stepped back slightly, giving the appearance of pulling away, but his words were razor-sharp as he continued. "I don't doubt that night was difficult for you," he said, his voice still smooth. "But memory can be unreliable, especially when emotions are involved." I gritted my teeth. Here it comes. The classic defense strategy, gaslighting. "Are you sure you remember everything correctly?" he asked. She didn't hesitate. "Yeah." The defense attorney barely blinked. "You had been drinking, hadn't you?" Her fingers tightened on the railing. "Someone gave me a drink, yes," she said, her voice measured. The attorney nodded, turning slightly toward the jury, as if pulling them into the conversation. "And you were in an unfamiliar place, surrounded by people you didn't know well?" "Yeah." The words were simple, direct, unshaken. But the attorney was relentless. "Is it possible," he said carefully, as if he were leading her to some inevitable realization, "that you misunderstood what was happening?" "No." Her voice was sharper now. The attorney didn't let up. "Is it possible that your memory of that night isn't as clear as you think?" The prosecutor objected again, and this time, the judge issued a warning to the defense. But the damage had been done. The defense attorney had planted enough questions to make the jury hesitate, to make them wonder, even for a second, if there was room for doubt. It was a chess game, and she knew it. She gripped the wooden railing of the witness stand tightly, her knuckles turning white. Her voice shook, but not from uncertainty, from anger. "I know what happened to me," she said. "The courtroom was so still I could hear my own heartbeat. I know what I saw," she continued, her voice stronger now. "I know who was there." The defense attorney tilted his head slightly again, considering her. Then he took one slow step closer. "You're sure?" The prosecutor's voice cut in immediately, objection asked and answered. Sustained. But she didn't wait for the prosecutor to guide her through the response. She sat up straighter. And then she said something that made the defense pause. Something that made the jury snap to attention. Something that made Diddy's fingers tighten ever so slightly against the table. She looked the attorney directly in the eyes and said, "I wasn't the only one in that room." The shift in the courtroom was instantaneous. People leaned forward. The reporters snapped back to life, pens scratching furiously against their notepads. The defense attorney froze for a fraction of a second, so small, so imperceptible, that most people might have missed it. "But I saw it, and so did she." The power dynamic had changed. She had been on the defensive this whole time, backed into a corner, forced to relive the worst moment of her life, while a team of lawyers tried to dismantle her piece by piece. But now she had given them something else. Something dangerous. Because if she wasn't the only one in that room, that meant there were others. Other witnesses. Other victims. And suddenly, this wasn't just about her anymore. The defense attorney stiffened. And for the first time since the trial started, Diddy moved. It was small, subtle, but I saw the way his fingers curled, just slightly, before he forced them to relax again. The mask didn't break. Not yet. But there were cracks now. The courtroom felt different. Like everyone in that room had just realized. This trial wasn't just about one night. It was about everything. And for the first time, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel since I stepped into that courtroom. Hope. Chapter 6. The moment that cannot be ignored. The courtroom had already been on edge, the silence so thick it felt like it had a weight of its own. Every seat was filled, every breath measured, every movement restrained, as if even the slightest shift could disrupt the gravity of what was unfolding. And then the prosecutor made a choice. Up until now, the defense had done everything in their power to poke holes in the testimony, to make her doubt herself, to make the jury hesitate even for a moment. But the prosecutor had been waiting, watching, measuring every moment, every word, every second of tension. She had seen the way the girl had steadied herself after every attempt to shake her, the way she had refused to back down even when they twisted her words, the way she had thrown them off balance with the revelation that she wasn't alone that night. And now it was time to strike. The prosecutor stepped forward, slow, controlled. She didn't rush. She didn't need to. "I want to go back," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "to that night, to the room." The girl's fingers twitched slightly against the railing. "You told us that you weren't the only one there," the prosecutor continued. "You told us that you saw people." A pause. "But I need you to describe what you saw, not just the people, the room." There was a shift in the air. A small one, barely noticeable at first, but I felt it. The girl's brows drew together slightly, not in fear, not in hesitation, but in realization. The defense attorney immediately leaned forward, sensing something. He wasn't the only one. A tension ran through the jury box, subtle but present. A few of them straightened in their seats, anticipating what was about to come next. The girl exhaled slowly. "It was dark," she said. Her voice wasn't weak. It was measured. There was a bed, she continued, her grip tightening on the railing. A couch, a glass table with drinks on it. The walls were dark, but not black, more like a deep gray. There were candles, but not for light, just for atmosphere. She swallowed hard, but she didn't stop. There was a camera. The room changed. It wasn't just the jurors who reacted. The judge leaned forward slightly. Reporters whispered among themselves, pens scratching furiously against their notepads. The defense attorney immediately stood. "Objection, Your Honor." Speculation. The judge didn't rule immediately. Instead, he looked at the prosecutor. "I need clarification." The prosecutor didn't blink. "Can you describe this camera?" she asked. The girl nodded. "It was in the ceiling," she said, her voice clear now, steady. "Near the corner. It wasn't big. You wouldn't notice it if you weren't looking for it, but I saw it. The red light, the lens, the camera, a hidden camera." And suddenly this case wasn't just about testimony anymore. It was about evidence. For the first time since this started, the jury was no longer just listening. They were absorbing, processing, considering. One juror, a woman in her 50s with glasses perched on the edge of her nose, reached up and covered her mouth. Another, a younger man who had seemed almost disengaged before, shifted in his seat, suddenly sitting straighter. And the judge? He was watching. Not the jury, not the attorneys. Diddy? The man at the defense table still didn't move. But I saw the way his lawyers did. The way one of them adjusted their tie too quickly. The way another reached for a legal pad but didn't write anything. Because now, this wasn't just about who said what. This was about proof. The prosecutor took another step. "You're certain?" The girl nodded again. "I know what I saw," she said. The defense attorney was already rising again, ready to interject. But before he could, the girl spoke again. "There was a scar," and just like that, the room dropped into silence again. "A scar?" the prosecutor repeated. The girl's breathing was heavier now, like she was pushing through something invisible. "Yes," she said, "on his hand." A murmur ran through the crowd. Not loud, but undeniable. The defense attorney's face hardened. "Objection, Your Honor, speculation." The judge hesitated. "Overruled for now. Continue." The girl licked her lips, gathering herself. "I remember because I was watching his hand," she said. "I couldn't move, but I could see it, the way it rested on the arm of the chair." She paused. The scar ran along his thumb, a little jagged, like an old cut that never healed right. I felt it before I saw it. The energy, the way the words landed like a blade against stone. The way Diddy's attorneys suddenly seemed too stiff, too unnatural in their movements. The way Diddy himself, who had remained motionless this entire time, shifted just slightly. It was tiny, just a fraction of a movement, but it was the first time he had reacted. And I saw it. So did the jury. So did the judge. The prosecutor was careful now, her voice deliberate. "You're absolutely certain of this?" The girl lifted her chin slightly. "Yes." Another pause. "Have you ever seen that scar before?" The girl shook her head. "No." And just like that, the defense had a problem. Because this wasn't something she could have read online. Wasn't something she could have fabricated. This was a detail she should not have known unless she had been in that room. And the jury knew it. I saw it in their faces, in the way they were looking at him now. Not as a celebrity, not as a businessman, not as a powerful industry figure.
But as a man who had been accused of something horrific and had just been identified in a way that could not be dismissed. The defense attorney stood up again. "Objection, Your Honor. This is speculation and it's prejudicial." The judge lifted a hand, silencing him.
He was thinking, weighing the significance of what had just happened. Finally, he turned to the girl. "You swear under oath that this is what you saw?" Yes. The judge exhaled. Then he made his ruling.
The testimony stands. A ripple of reaction ran through the courtroom. And just like that, everything changed. Because now this wasn't just about words. This was about details. Details that could be checked. Details that should not exist if she were lying. And the moment that realization hit, I saw it, the first crack in the defense, the first moment of doubt in Diddy's eyes. And for the first time, it was his silence that spoke the loudest.
Chapter 7. The man at the defense table. The room was still shifting, the weight of what had just been revealed settling in like dust after an explosion. But at the defense table, Diddy didn't move. Not at first. Not even when the gasps had echoed through the courtroom. Not even when the jury had stiffened, their expressions no longer neutral, no longer careful. Not even when the judge had ruled to allow the testimony, the kind of ruling that could turn the tide of the trial. He just sat there, unmoved, unshaken, unbothered. For a man who had just been accused of something that could destroy him, he was remarkably composed. I had watched him the entire trial, noting the way he carried himself, the way his attorneys did most of the speaking for him, how he rarely let his mask slip. But now, I was realizing something different. Diddy wasn't just calm. He was confident. He wasn't ignoring what was happening. He was waiting for the chaos to settle, waiting for the defense to recover, waiting for the inevitable shift back in his favor, because that's how things always worked for men like him. For a second, I wondered if he had planned for this, if he had known this moment was coming, if he had been warned, tipped off by someone who had already made sure there would be no evidence, no real consequences, no way for this to lead anywhere. Because that was the reality of men like him. They never panicked. They didn't have to. I shifted in my seat, watching him carefully. I had seen nervous defendants before. I had seen men accused of crimes shrink under the weight of it all. Seen them whisper frantically to their lawyers, their hands shaking against the desk, their expressions betraying the certainty of their own guilt. Diddy wasn't like them. He had been accused before, he had survived before. And to him, this was no different. It was a show, a game, a script that he had seen play out before, one that always ended the same way, with him walking away untouched. But the jury wasn't looking at him the same way anymore. I saw it. I saw it in the older woman who had covered her mouth earlier. I saw it in the young man who had once been disinterested, now sitting forward, eyes narrowed. I saw it in the way the judge had started watching him, not just as a defendant, but as something else entirely. A force, a threat, a man who had spent too long believing he was untouchable. One of his attorneys leaned toward him slightly, whispering something. Diddy barely reacted. No nod, no acknowledgement. Just that same unreadable stare. But I saw something else too. The slightest flex of his fingers against the table. A slow, controlled inhale through his nose. A small, careful adjustment of his jaw. It was a fraction of a reaction, but it was there, and for the first time I wondered, was he waiting or was he calculating? The prosecutor was speaking again now, shifting her focus back to the victim, but the words blurred in my ears as I kept my gaze locked on him. Something wasn't right. Something about his stillness felt unnatural now, because this wasn't the stillness of a man who had nothing to worry about. It was the stillness of a man who wasn't worried yet, and that was more terrifying. I didn't know what that meant. Not yet. But I was starting to understand something I hadn't before. This trial wasn't just about the past. It was about control. Control over the narrative, the people, the perception, the outcome. And Diddy wasn't sitting there because he had accepted that things were falling apart. He was sitting there because he was waiting for the moment when he could take it all back. One of the jurors, an older man with gray hair and tired eyes, glanced toward him. Diddy met his gaze, held it, didn't blink, didn't break eye contact, and the juror looked away first. I felt my stomach turn. I wanted to believe that this trial was different, that this time he wouldn't get away with it, that the weight of everything that had been said, everything that had been revealed, would finally be enough. But as I watched him, still unmoving, still eerily composed, I realized he had never thought it would come to this, because he had spent his entire life making sure it never could. Chapter 8. The gavel falls. The weight in the courtroom hadn't lifted. Not entirely. If anything, it had grown heavier, thickening the air like a storm pressing against the windows, waiting to break. The moment hung there, suspended in silence, until the judge's voice finally shattered it. "We will recess for the day." The sharp bang of the gavel cracked through the tension, but it did nothing to release it. The words should have signaled an end, or at least a pause, but no one in that room was ready to move. For a split second, no one reacted. It was as if everyone needed a moment to process what had just happened. And then the room broke open. Whispers erupted across the gallery, hushed but frenzied. People leaned toward one another, hands clutched over mouths, eyes darting toward the defense table, toward the jury box, toward Diddy. The court stenographer stretched her fingers, but her expression was tight, as if she knew she had just transcribed something historic. The jury didn't immediately file out. They sat there, uncertain, shifting in their seats. Some of them kept their eyes forward, staring blankly as if the weight of the moment was still pressing down on them. Others stole glances at Diddy. I watched as one juror, the woman with the glasses, the one who had covered her mouth earlier, slowly exhaled, her hands gripping the armrests of her chair like she was trying to steady herself. Another juror rubbed his hands against his knees, staring down like he was trying to ground himself. They weren't unaffected, and neither was I. I felt the weight of it in my chest, the feeling that something irreversible had just happened, something that couldn't be buried. The victim had been steadfast. She had endured everything thrown at her, the gaslighting, the condescension, the doubt, and she had refused to back down. But as I turned to look at her, I realized something crucial. She was still afraid. She stood stiffly as court officers led her toward the side exit, away from the crowd, away from the cameras. Her shoulders were squared, her jaw set, but her fingers clutched the sleeve of her blazer so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. I wasn't the only one watching her. Reporters sat forward, their pens ready, their eyes scanning every inch of her expression, looking for something they could turn into a headline. And beyond them, Diddy. He still hadn't moved. His attorneys were already gathering their papers, whispering among themselves, but he remained completely still. For the first time, I wondered if he had finally realized that this wasn't just another accusation he could outrun, that this time people were listening, that this time people believed her. And yet he still didn't look defeated. He wasn't rattled, he wasn't panicked. If anything, he seemed to be watching, measuring, calculating, like he was already thinking 5 steps ahead, deciding how to reclaim control of the narrative before it got too far from his grasp. The girl reached the exit, but before she stepped through, she hesitated, and then, slowly, she turned. Her eyes swept across the room, taking in everything: the jury, the spectators, the lawyers, and finally, him. She didn't flinch. She didn't lower her gaze. She just stared at him. For the first time, Diddy's fingers twitched. It was barely noticeable, a fraction of a movement, but she saw it. And I think in that moment, she knew that this wasn't over. Knew that the battle didn't end just because the gavel had fallen. Knew that outside this courtroom, there was a world still waiting to swallow her whole. But she didn't turn away first. He did. And then she was gone. The moment we stepped outside, the roar of the media swallowed everything. Reporters pressed forward, cameras flashing violently, microphones being shoved toward anyone remotely connected to the case. The questions came fast, relentless, desperate. Was the testimony credible? Do you think this will change the outcome? Is Diddy's legal team planning an emergency motion? Will there be more witnesses? The courtroom might have been a controlled environment, but out here, it was chaos. The prosecution walked quickly, ignoring the cameras. Diddy's lawyers moved just as fast, but with a different kind of urgency. They weren't just avoiding the media, they were controlling the damage. I could hear snippets of their strategy before they even reached their car. She's emotional. Jurors don't trust emotions. We push for misidentification, memory distortion, unreliable recollection. It was like watching a machine reboot itself. They had lost a round, but they were already building their counterattack. Diddy followed closely behind them, his expression unreadable. Then, a reporter shouted something that made him pause. "Mr. Combs, do you have anything to say to your accuser?" The crowd fell silent. The cameras turned. For a moment, I thought he might ignore it. But then he turned his head slightly. Not to the reporter, not to the cameras, but to the people, to the ones still willing to believe in him. He straightened his cuffs, adjusted his tie, and then he smiled. A slow, careful, practiced smile. Not one of amusement, not one of guilt, but one of certainty. Like he still knew something we didn't. And then, just as quickly, he was gone, slipping into a black SUV, the door shutting behind him with a heavy finality. But the damage had been done. This wasn't going away. Not this time. The jury had felt it. The courtroom had felt it. The world had felt it. And even Diddy, for all his power, all his influence, all his certainty, couldn't make this moment disappear. Not now, not anymore. I didn't move for a long time after that. The courthouse steps emptied, the crowd thinning as people dispersed, going back to their newsrooms, their studios, their homes, ready to turn this day into headlines, into stories, into history. But I stayed, because I wasn't ready to leave, because something about today, about everything that had just happened, felt too big to simply walk away from. I thought about the girl, about the way she had walked into that courtroom, alone, the way she had faced him, the way she had spoken words that could never be unsaid. And I thought about the fear that still lingered in her eyes, the kind of fear that didn't disappear just because people finally believed you, the kind of fear that stayed, that followed you home, that reminded you that even when the trial was over, the fight never really was. Because the truth? It was never about the courtroom. It was about power, and power never surrendered easily. I took a slow breath, finally stepping away from the courthouse steps. This wasn't the end. Not for her, not for him, not for any of us. But one thing was clear. The world was watching now, and no amount of silence could ever erase that.